Hi there guys, I'm Danny and welcome to today's episode of All Monsters Go to Space. So today I'm going to be going through the variations of the zombies, or zombie-like creatures in mythology. I won't be going too in depth with this as I will be coming back to them and doing individual videos. I also won't be mentioning ghouls from the Middle East as Phil will be covering them. And I also won't be mentioning zombies in popular culture because again, Phil will be covering that one in a future video. So let's start with what people think is the origin, although I will say that the name zombie did originate from here, Africa. There are a few different types of zombies throughout Africa. We have the reanimated dead body, a dead person who has been brought back through the act of magic, and a being that doesn't have a corporeal form. So the second kind is believed to have been created through magical means. Normally, they are created by a Bokor, a voodoo sorcerer. It is said that the Bokor would control these zombies. The first kind is like the ones the rest of the world knows, the vacant-eyed, shuffling, kind of slow walking dead. And finally, there is the incorporeal being, also known as an astral zombie. This being is actually just a part of the soul, and it's normally sealed within a jar. All of these beings were primarily from Haitian folklore, but can also be seen throughout most, if not all, Africa. But zombies do date back even further in Africa than the 17th and 18th century. Before this time, in Central to West African mythology, zombie-like creatures can be found. They resemble more of the astral zombie, were also called Kongonikisi spirits, or Jumbi in the English-speaking Caribbean. And in the French West Indies, what we would call zombies were more like nature spirits. Now to surprise some of you, I'm going to jump way back in time, back to the Stone Age. Yes, zombies, or at least suspected beliefs in zombies, date back this far. So throughout Syria, Europe, and even the Middle East, archaeologists have found graves that may hint at the fact that we were trying to keep the dead from rising. Bodies that have been found buried under an ancient settlement in Syria were discovered with their skulls detached, and it seems that they had been dug up years later and then decapitated. It also appeared that only specific bodies were chosen. They were all male and all young, usually between 18 to 30 years old. A member of the Spanish National Research Council, Juan José Ibanez, has suggested that the Stone Age people thought that the dead posed a threat to the living, but he also thought that on the other hand, the people may have believed that they could gain the deceased's strength through the ritual. Around the same time in the history of man, somewhere else in the world, people were using a different burial tradition to keep their dead 6 feet under, by placing piles of rocks or other heavy items on top of the cairns or burial mounds. This was to stop the dead from digging their way out, and some believe that this led to the creation of the tombstone. In the 1980s, in Necropolis, Sicily, graves were found covered in fragments of amphoras and rocks, amphoras being giant vases or vessels. The Greeks had colonized this area in approximately 800 BC, and they seemed to hold the belief that the dead could rise, so they would pin them down, but again, they only did this on select graves. It doesn't seem to matter about gender or age, as tomb 693 was that of an 8 to 13-year-old child, gender unknown. This leads me very neatly into my next section, Zombies of Europe, starting with the revenants from ancient Greece. Described as being a vastly decayed corpse with sunken eyes, torn fingernails and rotten teeth, the whole tea and biscuits. A very familiar imagery. The ancient Greeks feared that the dead would rise with only the intent on harming the living, and they believed these beings could be trapped in their graves by being tied up, placed face down, and staked into the ground. They could also be dismembered and burnt. In the Middle Ages, the belief changed slightly, or at least grew. It was believed that revenants were created from certain people, murder victims, being born illegitimately, being born on an unlucky day, or having an unfortunate death like drowning or of the plague. European writers of the time wrote that there was quite a few reports of revenants throughout Europe. Their reason for rising is slightly different though. Instead of it being a vendetta against all the living, they rise so that they could avenge some crime that had been done against them. Now in ancient Rome, they had the lemures. These creatures are also vengeful and prey on the living, but they are actually in control of their minds, unlike most zombies. It is believed that a lemures is created when they have been denied a proper burial or had been forgotten by the living. A weird little quirk for these beings is that the head of the household would wake up around midnight-ish and throw black beans behind them. The beings were believed to actually eat these beans, and also if you saw lemures, they could be scared away by banging bronze pots at them. The Republican and Imperial Rome had specific days to which they dedicated to placating the Lemures, and these days were May 9th, 11th, and 13th. So on those days, make sure to bring your bronze pots out. Now the Norse had a being called a draugr. These creatures were spirits that possessed the dead. It smelt like a rotting corpse and seemed to be intelligent. They were also swollen and black because of all the blood rushing up to the surface of their skin. They were also known to consume flesh. It was also noted that they were superhumanly strong and could actually increase their size, a little bit like titans. Draugrs would rise from their graves as a wisp of smoke, driving anything nearby them mad. It had been said that they rose to guard treasure or to torment those that had wronged them. Now it is said that the only way to get rid of a draugr, especially as they are immune to weapons, is to wrestle them back into their graves and bind them with spells. Binding spells in Norse runestones have actually been found on graves. But here's the catch. Only a hero was able to do the wrestling. So over to Germany now. They have the Knux, although this one feeds on dead bodies and not the living, but it will steal the life force from them instead. These creatures can also shapeshift, much like the draugr. If their shadow fell on a person, or if they climbed a bell tower to ring the bells, then anyone affected, whether that's by the shadow falling on them or by hearing the bells, would die. Again, these beings were created by accidental deaths or those by illnesses. A few of the only methods to stop them is by putting a coin in their mouth, beheading, and putting a stake through their heart. As you can see, there's a lot of similarity between zombies and vampires with the stake through the heart thing. Now Romania have their own zombie version, the Strigoi. These creatures also have superhuman strength, super speed, and super senses, shapeshifting, and immortality. They also apparently have weather manipulation, spell casting, and immunity to sunlight. Strigois were created by being born illegitimately and dying before baptism. Now figuring out who could become a Strigoi is fairly easy, as it's also anyone who is unmarried. So to avoid this from happening, they marry the deceased off to a living person of a similar age who has also been unmarried before. Another way Romanians prevent the dead from rising is that they would bury a bottle of wine close to the burial site, then after 6 weeks a person or a group of people return and drink from it, and it is believed that if someone drinks from that particular bottle, they will be protected against any attacks from the Strigoi. And last but not least in Europe, there is the Scandinavian Zombie. These undead beings are disease spreaders, and they also prey on the living. They're also created by having been murdered or being a murderer. They can pass on their zombieism, or at least cause illness, by pinching someone. And to ward them off, you could wear a crucifix and or carve an inscription on their grave. And another way to prevent them from being able to rise is that they would be carried around a church 3 times. Now, to hop over to East Asia, starting with China, their type of zombie is the Qiangxi. Again, these are created by being victims of murders and unfortunate deaths, or simply by just refusing to enter the afterlife. They tend to appear as a mouldy, almost fur-covered white corpse, with long white hair and dressed in white funeral robes. They could only travel by hopping and can leap large distances. The Jiangshi absorbs the life force of the living rather than eating flesh, and they can also be found throughout Vietnam, Korea, Malaysia, and Japan. They hide during the day, mainly in caves, but also they do reside in their own coffins. To stop these creatures, at least enough to be able to get away from them, you can throw coins or rice behind you. Much like with fairies, the Jiangshi would have to stop and count it all. You could also put a piece of sacred paper on their foreheads, much like you see in animes or mangas, where they have that long strip of paper that's got the Chinese writing on it. Those are sacred ritual papers that are made to prevent spirits from wreaking havoc on the living. So Indonesia and Malay, they named their zombie Pontianak, potentially meaning she who has died in childbirth, which pretty much explains how these beings are created. Like a lot of Asian undead, she is exceptionally pale with long black hair and a white burial robe, as it is their traditional funeral attire. Also, their clothing is normally smeared in blood. They prey on men and helpless people. To men, she shows up as a very attractive female, and to others, she makes the sound of a crying infant to lure in her victims. It's said she uses her claws to attack, and then she eats them to sustain herself. Now the next 3 beings are all from Japan, starting with one of the oldest ones, and also technically a god, and that is Izanami. She gave birth to the 8 islands that then became Japan. Then after this she gave birth to 5 more, whilst dying during the 6th. Izanagi, her husband, was so distraught that he killed the 6th island, creating a lot of the Japanese deities, and he also couldn't handle feel the loss of his wife, so he went to the underworld to get her back. But unfortunately it was too late. She had eaten the food and had become corrupted. When her husband saw her rotted appearance, he turned and fled. She and 8 other hags chased him. He exited the underworld and blocked the entrance with a boulder. She declared that she would have revenge and kill 1,000 people, where he said that if she did, he would create 1,500 more. Next up is the new Peppo, and this is one of my personal favourites. It's very different in appearance than the others. This poor creature is an amorphous blob with suggestions at eyes and a mouth with arms and legs. It is said to have been created from dead flesh, a bit Frankenstein-esque I guess, and it has a pungent odour of rotting flesh. It is approximately 1.5 feet tall and is passive in nature, so it poses no harm at all to people, but because of its appearance, they do tend to scare others away. So although it doesn't harm anyone and it doesn't feed off them, I counted it because it is made out of dead flesh. Also, it tends to wander during the twilight hours, in and around temples, empty streets, and near grave sites. The last being from Japan is the Hana Owner, or Bone Woman. As her name says, she's a skeletal woman who appears as she was in life to those that knew and loved her. She rises from the dead because she loves someone so much that she can't be without them even in the afterlife. She will rise every night, go to her loved one, but she's always gone by morning, and then while she's there she feeds on their life force. Now the loved ones are normally at first wary of this being, but then it's their loved one, so they're also happy that they get to see them again. They don't realise that they're being fed upon. Without intervention, the person that is being fed upon will obviously eventually die. Now, the loved ones will only see her as she once was whilst she was living, and will only become aware that she's actually a skeletal woman if they have great faith or are actually told about it. In this case, the Hana Owner will then become aggressive. And then last but not least, the Rolangs from Tibet. These creatures are usually created by 2 beings, the Gadon spirits, who have broken an oath or become evil, and the Begeg spirits, who were always evil. The Rolangs are odd zombies, as they're very stiff. They cannot bend their limbs, or even at the middle, so they have a very odd kind of hopping walk almost. They also have a long tongue that they wave at their victims. Their aim is to create others by infecting humans, much like we see in a lot of zombie films. Normally this is actually with a touch on the head. That's how they infect others. So these beings can be a little bit difficult to kill, as it were, to use the term loosely. There are 5 types of Rolangs: a blood, bone, flesh, skin, and mole types. These names signify how they can be killed. For a blood one, they have to be made to bleed. Fairly easy, I guess. The flesh and skin types have to be cut deeply. The bone type needs to have their bones broken. And then finally, and the hardest one of all, is the mole type, as they can only be dispatched by pricking a particular mole on their body. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you know of any other zombie-like creatures, then let me know. It's always a fascinating subject. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next one.